The door I put my hand on that morning wasn't on the schematic. That's the thing I keep coming back to, later, when I try to explain why I made the call I made. I've been servicing industrial refrigeration for about 11 years, mostly across Nebraska and Iowa, and by March 2020, I had a rhythm to it. Show up before first shift, check the drawings against what's actually installed, walk the compressors, pull the panels, log everything twice, because insurance people love paperwork. 9 times out of 10, the job is boring. That's the whole point of being good at it. The plant in Sioux City wasn't on my normal route. My usual guy for that region had come down with something bad in the first week of March, and back then nobody was really sure yet what to call it, so the company was shuffling us around. I got the ticket on a Tuesday night for a Wednesday morning walkthrough. Food processing, poultry mostly, some pork side, 12 chambers on the sheet, standard mix of blast freezers and holding rooms. I got there around 5 in the morning. The lot was half full already. Older sedans, a few pickups with Iowa plates, and a couple from South Dakota. Sky was still black. The building was one of those long, low concrete places with the loading docks on the east side. No windows to speak of, just vents and pipe runs and a single steel door for anyone not driving a forklift. The manager met me in the hallway outside the break room. Guy named Kurt, 50s, thick around the middle, high-vis vest over a flannel shirt, and one of those cheap paper masks that were suddenly everywhere that month. He shook my hand without really shaking it, handed me a clipboard, walked me through the layout on paper, told me which rooms were being emptied for me and which ones I'd have to work around. Then he said the thing that stuck with me later. He said the numbers on the schematic didn't match the numbers painted above the doors because they'd renovated in 2015 and never updated the drawings. He laughed a little when he said it, like it was a running joke. The first 6 chambers were fine. Compressor on chamber 3 was running hot, but nothing dangerous. I flagged it for a follow-up. Chamber 5 had a bad gasket. I noted the part number. By 10, I was on my second coffee from the break room machine and starting to feel human again. Chamber 7 is where it got weird. On the schematic, there were 12 chambers. When I walked the actual back corridor, counting doors, I got 13. I did it twice. Went back to the sheet, checked the layout, went back to the corridor. 13 doors. The extra one was between what the drawing called 7 and 8, tucked into a little alcove behind a stack of blue plastic pallets. It had its own padlock, not the plant's standard lock system either. A separate hasp bolted on over the regular handle, heavy brass padlock, the kind you'd use on a storage unit. I found Kurt in his office, told him about the door. He didn't look up from his monitor for a couple seconds. Then he said, and I remember this pretty clearly, he said, "That's a quarantine hold for rejected product. Corporate handles that one. You don't have access, and honestly, you don't need it." I asked if it was on a shared compressor line with anything I was working on. He said no. He said it had its own dedicated unit on the roof, serviced by a different contractor out of Omaha. He said it in that flat way that meant the conversation was over. I went back to the corridor. Finished up chamber 8, which was easy, just a coil clean and a temperature calibration. When I stepped out to grab a new set of gauges from my truck, I passed the padlocked door again, and I stopped. There was a sound, not loud. If the compressor for chamber 8 had been running, I'd never have caught it. But 8 was cycled down while I worked on it, and the corridor was quiet enough that I could hear the little rhythmic thing coming through the steel. It wasn't mechanical. Compressors have a hum, condensers have a whine. This wasn't either of those. It was softer, and it was steady, and it had gaps in it, like a pattern. I stood there for maybe 15 seconds trying to place it. I couldn't. I put my hand flat against the door, just below the padlock plate. And that's when I noticed the second thing. The door was warm, not room temperature. Not cool, warm. The way a car hood is warm an hour after you've parked it. Every other chamber door in that building was cold enough to fog when you breathed on it. I've put my hand on maybe 2,000 cold storage doors in my career. This one felt like the wrong side of a wall. I pulled my hand back and stepped away. Just stood in the corridor for a minute. My brain was already trying to explain it. Bad seal, failed unit. Maybe the chamber wasn't actually being used for cold storage anymore. Maybe they'd converted it to dry goods and just kept the door. That would cover the temperature. And the sound could be a fan, a heater, anything except the padlock. And the way Kurt had said, "You don't need it." I walked back to my truck and sat in the cab for a while. It was maybe 30 degrees outside and I had the heater running. I pulled up the plant on my phone. There's an aerial view you can get. I counted the roof units. There were 7 and only 6 chambers on my sheet had rooftop condensers. The 7th was over where the padlocked door would be. Kurt hadn't lied about that part. I went back inside and did chambers 9 through 12. I did them properly. When you're spooked, the worst thing you can do is start cutting corners, because then you owe the job a second visit and you don't want a second visit. I logged everything. I took my photos. I refilled my coffee once. While I was working on 11, I heard footsteps in the corridor, not workers. Workers wore rubber boots and you could hear them from 30 feet. These were softer, 2 sets, moving past the alcove, not stopping. I didn't look up. I kept my head down and pretended to be reading a gauge. When I finished 12, it was almost 3 in the afternoon. Kurt walked me to the front and asked if everything checked out. I said the report would be in his inbox by end of day. He shook my hand again, that same half shake, and told me to drive safe. I made it to the interstate before I pulled over. I sat in the lot of a come and go off the exit for maybe 10 minutes, trying to think of what to say and to who. I'm not a cop, I'm not a lawyer, I fix compressors. Half of what I had was a padlock and a warm door and a sound I couldn't identify, and the other half was a feeling, and feelings don't hold up when someone asks you what you actually saw. But I kept thinking about the extra door, and the way it wasn't on the drawing. I looked up the National Trafficking Hotline on my phone. I'd never called it before. Never called any hotline in my life, honestly. I'm not the calling type. The woman who answered was calm in a way that made me feel like she'd had this exact conversation before, with people who sounded exactly like me. I told her what I did for a living. I told her where I'd been that morning. I gave her the address of the plant. I described the corridor, the alcove, the padlock, the sound, the warmth on the door. I told her about the 7 rooftop units and the 12 chambers on the schematic. I told her what Kurt had said, word for word as best I could remember it. She asked me a few things. Did I see any people I couldn't account for? Did I see anything on the loading dock that seemed unusual for a poultry line? Were there any vehicles in the lot that didn't fit the pattern? I told her honestly, I hadn't been looking for that. I hadn't known I should be looking. She said they'd pass it along. She said sometimes tips like this went somewhere, and sometimes they didn't. And she couldn't tell me which one this was going to be. She thanked me for calling. That was it. The whole call took maybe 12 minutes. I drove home. I didn't sleep great that night, but not because I was scared. More because I was running the day back through my head trying to figure out what I'd missed. The workers I'd passed in the corridor, the cars in the lot, the soft footsteps while I was on chamber 11. I had a list of things I could have noticed and hadn't. A week later, Kurt called me. Not the dispatch office, him personally, on my direct line, which he shouldn't have had. He was polite. He asked how I was doing, said he hoped my family was staying healthy with everything going on. Then he said the plant had decided to consolidate its service contracts, and my company's services were no longer required. He said they'd already notified my dispatcher. He said it in the same flat voice he'd used about the door. I asked if there was a problem with my report. He said no. He said the report was fine. He said everything was fine. And then he hung up. I don't know what happened at that plant. I don't know if the call went anywhere, or if someone drove out there, or if they opened the door, or if there was nothing behind it at all, and I'd talked myself into a story out of a padlock and a bad drawing. I've thought about driving back up there just to see if the building's still running. I haven't. What I know is this. The door was warm. There was a sound. Kurt fired me on a Wednesday, 1 week to the day after I stood in that corridor, and when I try now to remember the exact rhythm of what I heard through the steel, I can't. It's gone. But I remember standing there with my hand on the door thinking, whatever this is, it isn't food. I work the graveyard intake shift at the county coroner's office in Phoenix. 3 years now, give or take. Until this February, I would have told you the weirdest thing about the job was how fast you stop noticing the smell. What I'm about to write happened on a Tuesday. Or technically Wednesday, sometime after 2 in the morning. I'm writing it because the incident report they filed doesn't say what I saw, it says something else. And every time I clock in, I think, if I don't put this down somewhere, eventually I'm going to convince myself it didn't happen. The job itself isn't complicated. Bodies come in from all over the county. Traffic, hospitals, houses, the desert past 3:03 in summer when someone stops answering their phone. My part is intake. Meet the transport driver at the bay door, confirm paperwork, tag the body, log it, wheel it into the cooler, assign a cell. That's it. Once they're in a cell, the pathologists deal with them in the morning. On a slow night, I might do 2, 3 intakes. On a bad night, I've done 9. That night started slow. I remember I'd microwaved a burrito around midnight and eaten half of it before the first call came in. The rest went cold on the desk in the anteroom, next to a paperback I'd been dragging around for weeks and hadn't actually opened. The AC in intake runs cold on purpose. In February, in Phoenix, at 2 in the morning, it's genuinely uncomfortable. I wear a hoodie under the smock and keep a mug of coffee on the desk just to hold something warm. First body came in around 1:40. Transport was a guy named Marco, who I've worked with maybe 50 times. Single car MVA off the I-17 near Peoria. Male, maybe 40s, no wallet, no phone recovered. Head was covered because of what the windshield had done. Marco called him a presumed John, meaning presumed John Doe until PD ran prints in the morning. I signed for him. Wheeled him inside, started the intake. I want to be clear about this part because I've gone over it in my head 100 times. I tagged him. 2 tags, that's the protocol. One on the right big toe with a plastic strap, one on the outside of the pouch with a clip. Both tags had the same case number generated by the intake computer when I logged him in. I wrote unknown M/MVA/I-17 Peoria on both by hand. My handwriting on the pouch tag was a little slanted because I was hurrying. I remember that. I remember the slant. I put him in cell 14, lower row, third from the right in the north bank. I closed the door, I heard the latch, I logged the placement in the system. I went back to my burrito. Marco was already gone by then. Anteroom was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a compressor kicked on. Otherwise, nothing. The second call came in a little after 3:30. Different transport, woman named Deb, different scene. Single vehicle MVA on Camelback near 32nd. Driver went off into a block wall. Male, presumed 40s. No ID on him either, head covered, same reason. I remember thinking, 2 head injury Johns in one shift, that's a run of bad luck for somebody's records team. I didn't think anything past that. Deb wanted to smoke before her paperwork, so I told her to go ahead. I wheeled the new one into intake, started the tags. Assigned him cell 15, right next to the first, because 14 was full, and I like to keep the unknowns adjacent so pathology can batch them. I walked to the cooler, I opened cell 15, empty, clean, ready, fine. I opened cell 14 to double check something in the paperwork. I honestly can't remember what. I think I wanted to compare the intake time on the tag against what I'd typed into the system. Cell 14 was empty. The tray was in. The tray was clean. On the tray, near the head end, was the toe tag. Just the toe tag. The plastic strap was intact. Not cut, not stretched, not broken. My slanted handwriting on it. Case number matching the one I generated an hour and a half earlier. No body, no pouch tag. I stood there for a second with the door open. The cooler runs at around 38 degrees, and I could feel it on my face, and I remember thinking very clearly, okay, I put him in 13. I put him in 13, and I wrote 14 in the log. That's what happened. I opened 13, empty. I opened 12, empty. I went down the whole north bank, one door at a time. Empty, empty, empty. And then the 2 long-term residents in 6 and 4 who'd been there since January. Both accounted for, both correctly tagged. I did the south bank. Nothing. I did the overflow room where we hold pending pickups. Nothing there either. I stood in the middle of the cooler and I could hear my own breathing. I want to say I panicked. I didn't, really. Whatever I felt, it was more like the room getting very small and very quiet at the same time. What I did was walk back out to intake and look at the second body still on the transport gurney where I'd left him, still zipped, head still covered, and I thought about how similar the paperwork was. Same age range, same MVA, same head trauma, different part of town. I unzipped the pouch to the shoulders. I'd like to skip this part, but the whole reason I'm writing this is so I don't skip it. The face was messed up. I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup even if I'd known him. But on his left forearm, near the wrist, was a tattoo. A little compass, faded, cheap ink, the kind of thing you get on a dare when you're 19. I'd seen it on the first body. I'd noticed it when I was fastening the toe tag, because his hand had been resting close to his foot inside the pouch and the compass had been right there at eye level, and I'd thought, that's a rough tattoo, and then I'd thought nothing else about it, and moved on. Same tattoo, same wrist, same guy. I zipped him back up. I went and got Deb from the smoke bench, and I asked her very calmly whether by any chance her scene and Marco's scene had gotten crossed at dispatch. She laughed at first, then she saw my face. She said no, her scene was hers. She'd been there for 2 hours. She'd watched them cut him out. I asked her if the guy she brought in had had a wallet on him. She said yeah, actually, they'd found it in the footwell. She'd handed it to me with the paperwork. It was sitting on my desk. It was sitting on my desk. I had signed for it. I did not remember signing for it. My signature was on the property receipt in my own handwriting. Driver's license inside. Male, 43. Address in Sunny Slope. Photo matched what was left of the face, as well as any DMV photo ever matches anything. I called my supervisor at home. It rang 4 times. When he picked up, his voice was thick with sleep, and I couldn't figure out how to say the first sentence. So I just said we had a placement issue in cell 14, and he needed to come in. Then I called security. I sat in the anteroom under the fluorescent light with the cold burrito in front of me, and I did not go back into the cooler until other people were there. They pulled the footage. I want to be specific about this because the footage is the part that still bothers me the most. There are cameras on the bay door. There are cameras in the intake room. There is one camera in the cooler mounted above the door, looking down the center aisle. All three were working. All three had continuous recording. Between the moment I closed cell 14 and the moment I opened it, no one entered the cooler. Cell 14's door did not open. Nothing moved in that aisle. The footage from intake shows me wheeling the first body in, tagging him, and putting him in cell 14. It shows me walking out. It shows nothing else until Deb arrives with the second body almost 2 hours later. The pouch and the pouch tag from cell 14 were never found. Internal review took about 6 weeks. 2 people from the county came in and interviewed me twice. I wrote a statement. I wrote a second statement when they said the first one wasn't detailed enough. I described the toe tag on the empty tray. I described the compass tattoo. I described the wallet I did not remember accepting. The final report classifies the event as a tagging and placement protocol failure. It says the intake technician, meaning me, likely tagged the same decedent twice under 2 different case numbers due to fatigue and a coincidental similarity in scene descriptions, and that the wallet was received and logged in a state of reduced attention. The toe tag on the empty tray is explained as one of the duplicates I had generated and misplaced. The missing pouch will be treated as an inventory discrepancy. My statement is attached to the file as an appendix. It has not, to my knowledge, been read by anyone since it was filed. I still work the same shift. I still do intake. Marco still brings me Johns off the I-17 sometimes, and we still joke about the coffee in the break room. I have not, once, in the months since, opened cell 14 without pausing at the handle for a second first. That's the only thing that's really changed. Well, that and the burrito. I don't eat during shift anymore. I don't know why that's the piece I can't get past, but I don't. The referral came through in early September, right after Labor Day. Blue Cross, standard authorization, 12 sessions approved up front. I run a small practice in a converted brownstone off Belden, 2nd floor, 2 rooms and a waiting area with a white noise machine that never quite works. Most of my patients that fall were still coming in with masks on. He wasn't. I noticed that first. He walked in wearing a pale gray hoodie and jeans, no mask, and when I gestured toward the box by the door, he just shook his head. "I had it in April," he said, twice. I didn't push. His voice was so quiet I had to lean forward. Let's call him A. That's the initial I used in my notes. He was 28, worked from home doing something with insurance claims, lived in Rogers Park with 2 neighbors on his floor. He filled out the intake form in pencil. Under reason for visit, he'd written one word: noise. The first 10 minutes were normal. Sleep is bad, appetite is fine, no history of medication, no history of hospitalization. Mother in Berwyn, father dead since he was 14, no siblings. I asked him what he meant by noise. He looked at the corner of the room for a long time. Then he said, "Not sound. I don't know why I wrote that. More like other people's thinking. I hear it the way you hear traffic through a window. All the time. It never stops." Okay, so we're doing that. I've been in this work 14 years. I've had the delusions of reference. The thought insertion, the guy who was convinced his upstairs neighbor was broadcasting to him through the radiator. There's a script for it. You don't argue, you don't validate, you gather. So I asked him to describe what he was hearing right then. He looked past me, at the window behind my chair. He said, "Your neighbor downstairs is thinking about coffee. She wanted to make another cup, but she's out of the oat milk, and she's annoyed because her husband said he'd pick some up and he didn't. She's looking at her phone right now trying to decide if she should text him or just let it go." The building has 4 units. The one below mine is a woman named Nadia. I know her because we split the shared trash bill. Her husband works at a hospital. I had no idea what she was doing at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning, and neither did A, and I wrote his exact words down in the margin of my legal pad because that's what you do. Then I redirected. The rest of the session went normally. Anxiety, isolation, flat effect, no acute risk. I recommended weekly sessions and a psychiatric consult for the auditory experiences, which he politely declined. He paid his copay in cash and left at 3 minutes past the hour. I stared at my notes for a while after he was gone. Then I told myself the sensible thing, which is that he'd probably heard Nadia complain in the hallway, or he'd projected a generic domestic scene onto an imagined stranger, or he'd gotten lucky with a guess. Coffee, husband, phone. It's not a specific accusation. It could describe half the women in the zip code on any given morning. A week goes by. I ran into Nadia in the vestibule on the Sunday before A's second appointment. She was carrying groceries in from her car. I helped her with a bag, and while we were waiting for the mail carrier to move his cart, I asked her, real casual, how her week had been. She rolled her eyes. She said, "Ask me about last Tuesday." My husband, right? He said he'd pick up oat milk on his way home from his shift. He didn't. I was standing in my kitchen at like 11 in the morning trying to decide if I was going to text him and start a fight or just be an adult about it. She laughed. I let it go, but I was mad. I remember I said something like, "That sounds annoying." I remember the fluorescent light in the vestibule buzzing a little, the way it does. I remember I went upstairs and sat at my desk for maybe 20 minutes without doing anything. Coincidence is a real thing. I want to be clear about that. In this job, you learn to respect it, because if you don't, you start seeing patterns in every intake, and you're useless to everyone. So I ran through the alternatives. He could have met her. He could have overheard her in the lobby. He could have followed her. All of those were more likely than what he'd said being true, but he'd said it in real time. He'd described a woman I'd never mentioned, in a building he'd never entered, doing a thing she was actually, at that moment, doing. Second session, I decided I was going to test him, not obviously. I sat down, went through the check-in questions, and then I asked him, in the middle of a completely different conversation, what my receptionist was thinking. I don't have a receptionist. There was no one in the waiting room. I wanted to see if he'd invent something. He said, there's no one out there. Then he said, "The man in the office next to yours is thinking about his son's baseball practice. He's supposed to leave at 5 to drive him, and he doesn't want to. He's going to anyway." The office next to mine is rented by a tax attorney I've said maybe 40 words to in 3 years. I didn't know he had a son. I didn't know if he had a son. I finished the session. I don't remember what we talked about. I remember writing "test again" in the margin. By the 4th session, I had stopped testing him because I didn't want any more results. He was giving them to me anyway. He'd tell me what his mother was thinking about in Berwyn. He'd tell me what the woman on the bus that morning had been worrying about. He'd tell me, in the same even voice, without pride, without pleading. He was just reporting the weather. He asked me once if I could turn the white noise machine up. I asked why. He said, "It doesn't help with the thinking, but it helps me not know what you're about to say next." I want to tell you I approached this like a professional. I did, up to a point. I consulted a colleague, in the vaguest possible terms, about differential diagnosis for a patient with unusually specific delusions of reference. She said what I would have said: schizotypal, possibly first episode psychotic. Refer out, get him medicated, don't play along. I didn't refer him out. I told myself I was still gathering. That was a lie. I was staying because I wanted to know what he was. The last session was on a Thursday, late September. It had rained all morning, and the streets were that shade of black you only get in Chicago in the fall, when the leaves are down, but the snow hasn't started. He came in a little late. He apologized. He sat down. That morning, before work, I had been standing at my kitchen counter with my phone in my hand, thinking about calling my sister. We hadn't spoken since our mother's memorial in June. There'd been a thing about the house, and it had gotten ugly, and I'd been meaning to call her for weeks. I'd picked up my phone. I'd looked at her name in my contacts. I'd put the phone back down and made coffee and driven to work. I had not told anyone about this. I had not written it down. I had not, as far as I know, said her name out loud in months. Sat across from me. He didn't look at the corner of the room this time. He looked right at my face, which he almost never did. He said, "You were thinking about calling your sister this morning. You didn't." I didn't answer. He waited. He wasn't smug about it. He looked, if anything, a little tired, like he'd been carrying something and he was setting it down for a second. I said the session was going to have to end early. I said something about a conflict of interest, that I'd realized during the week that I wasn't the right fit, that I was going to refer him to someone I trusted at Northwestern, with more experience in what he was describing. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. He nodded. He said, "Okay." He didn't argue. He stood up at the door and he almost said something. I saw him think about it. Then he just said, "Thanks for trying." And he left. I sat in my office until it got dark. Then I wrote the referral letter. My handwriting on the envelope came out shaky, which surprised me because I didn't feel afraid. I still don't know what I felt. I mailed it the next morning. I never heard from him again. I called my sister that night. We talked for about 6 minutes. It was fine. It was a normal call. When I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time with the phone in my hand, and I tried very hard not to think about anything at all.